Blood still stained the observation platform from the last handler who had tried to feed the creature. Professor Helm stared at the dark smear through his protective goggles and felt a familiar mix of pride and frustration. 14 deaths in 3 years. 14 trained professionals who had worked with the most dangerous specimens in the galaxy, all torn apart by the thing he kept in Cell 7. The Thorian scientist adjusted his recording device and spoke into it. Day 1042. Subject Skur continues to show zero signs of domestication or behavioral modification. All attempts at conditioning have failed. The creature remains as hostile as the day we extracted it from Verdun 3. Behind the triple reinforced barriers, something moved in the shadows. 8 limbs scraped against metal. A low rumble echoed through the observation deck, making the other researchers step back instinctively. Only Helen remained in place. He had spent too many years studying the Ravager to fear it now. Fear was for those who didn't understand. He understood perfectly. This was a perfect killer that answered to no one. "Professor, the new specimens have arrived," Tess called from the entrance. His assistant, a young Thorian female with pale blue skin, held a data pad. 16 total. Most are common species. But there's one human. Helm barely glanced away from Skur's enclosure. A human? From where? Pirate raid on a colony transport. They sold him to our acquisition team. Tess scrolled through the information. Name is David Reed, 32 years old. Worked as a mechanic on cargo ships. No military background. Nothing remarkable. Process him with the others. Helen waved a hand dismissively. Humans were becoming more common in the outer sectors. They were expanding fast, settling worlds that other species found too harsh. Interesting from an anthropological standpoint, but not his area of expertise. He studied apex predators, not omnivorous primates. The facility hummed with activity as the new specimens were brought in. Each one was placed in a containment cell, scanned, cataloged, and assigned a research schedule. David Reed found himself in Cell 12, a bare room with a sleeping platform, a waste unit, and walls that glowed with soft light. Through a narrow window, he could see a corridor and other cells across the way. He sat on the platform and rubbed his wrists where the restraints had been. 2 weeks ago, he had been fixing a coolant leak on the transport ship Meridian. Now he was property taken by pirates and sold like cargo. The aliens who processed him had been efficient and cold. They scanned every part of his body, took samples of his blood, and recorded his voice. No one had explained where he was or what would happen to him. A researcher came by with food. It was a gray paste in a bowl, bland but edible. David ate it slowly, watching the corridor. Other specimens were visible in nearby cells. A creature with 4 arms and crystalline skin. Something that looked like a walking plant. A being made entirely of geometric shapes that shifted and rotated. All of them looked as confused and afraid as he felt. Night came. The facility's lights dimmed to simulate darkness. David lay on the platform, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced with thoughts of home, of the life he had lost, of what his family would think when they heard he was missing. Then the roaring started. It came from somewhere deeper in the facility. A sound so deep and violent that it made the walls vibrate. Other specimens began making distressed noises. The crystalline creature covered what might have been its ears. The plant being curled into itself. The geometric shape spun rapidly in what looked like panic. David sat up and listened. It was an animal sound, wild and angry. Something big. Something dangerous. He had heard sounds like that before, growing up on the frontier colony where predators still roamed beyond the settlement walls. His father had taught him to recognize the calls of different creatures. This one was a challenge, a declaration of dominance. He lay back down and closed his eyes. After a moment, he drifted into sleep. In the morning, Tess made her rounds and checked on the new specimens. Most had barely slept. The noise from Skur's enclosure had terrified them. It always did. But when she reached Cell 12, she found the human lying peacefully on his platform, breathing slowly and deeply. She made a note in her data pad. Subject Reed appears unaffected by nocturnal stress stimuli. The days began to blur together. David was subjected to tests. They measured his strength, his reflexes, his intelligence. They exposed him to different environments, temperatures, atmospheric conditions. He cooperated because there was no point in resisting. The researchers treated him like equipment, necessary but unremarkable. On the fifth day, Professor Helm gathered several visiting scientists for a tour of the facility. It was a chance to show off his collection, to demonstrate the variety and quality of specimens he maintained. They walked through the corridors in a group, stopping at different cells while Helm explained his research. They came to the predator section. The visitors pressed close to the barriers, eager to see the legendary Sker. Helm began his usual speech about the creature's capabilities, its perfect adaptation as a hunter, its complete resistance to any form of training. David was being moved through the corridor at the same time, escorted by a guard to another testing room. The group of scientists blocked the path. He waited patiently, standing several meters from Sker's enclosure. That was when the creature appeared at its barrier. 8 limbs gripped the reinforced metal. A head that was all angles and sharp edges pushed forward. Eyes, 6 of them, black and reflective, scanned the group of scientists. Most of them stepped back. Helm smiled, enjoying their fear. But Sker wasn't looking at them. The Ravager's eyes fixed on David, its head tilted, a gesture that Helm had never seen it make before. For a long moment, neither the human nor the creature moved. David looked back calmly, his expression neutral. No fear, no aggression, just quiet observation. Then David's guard urged him forward, and he continued down the corridor. Sker watched him go, its eyes tracking every step until the human disappeared around a corner. Professor Helm stood very still, his mind racing. In 3 years, Sker had shown only 2 reactions to other beings: attack or ignore. Never this, never focused interest without violence. He turned to Tess. Bring up all data on the human, everything. Something impossible had just happened in his facility, and Professor Helm needed to understand it. David learned the routine quickly. Wake when the lights came on. Eat the gray paste they brought him. Wait for the researchers to take him to whatever test they had planned. Return to his cell. Sleep while the creature down the hall roared into the darkness. Repeat. But something had changed after that moment in the corridor. Professor Helm began appearing at his cell more frequently, always watching, always recording. The tests became more specific. They showed him images of various creatures and monitored his reactions. They played sounds and measured his stress responses. They seemed to be looking for something, though David couldn't guess what. On the 10th day, Tess arrived at his cell with different instructions. "You're being moved to a new observation area," she said. Her voice was gentler than the other researchers. "Please follow me." David walked beside her through corridors he hadn't seen before. They went deeper into the facility, past sections marked with warning symbols. The air grew colder. The walls were thicker here, reinforced with layers of metal and something that shimmered like energy fields. They reached a room that was split in 2 by a transparent barrier. One side was furnished like his cell. The other side was darker, larger, with higher ceilings and rough surfaces that looked like artificial rock formations. "You'll be staying here for a while," Tess explained. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "It's part of the research." David looked at the dark side of the room. "What's going over there?" Before Tess could answer, something moved in the shadows beyond the barrier. 8 limbs, sharp angles, 6 black eyes that caught the light like polished stones. "The professor wants to observe interactions," Tess said quietly. "You'll be safe. The barrier is unbreakable, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. This isn't right." She left quickly, the door sealing behind her. David stood in the center of his new space and looked at the creature on the other side of the transparent wall. Sker pressed close to the barrier, studying him with those unblinking eyes. Its body was massive, easily 3 times his size. The 8 limbs could be used for walking or grasping, and they ended in curved claws that looked sharp enough to cut through metal. Its head was protected by natural armor, ridged and layered like overlapping shields. He had seen creatures like this before, though not this exact species. Apex predators existed on every world that had complex life. They evolved to hunt, to kill, to dominate their environment. His home colony had been plagued by pack hunters called ridge runners. Fast, smart, and completely without mercy. David walked closer to the barrier. Sker's eyes tracked every movement. He stopped an arm's length from the transparent wall and sat down cross-legged on the floor. "So you're the one making all that noise at night," he said. Sker's head tilted again. The same gesture from the corridor. A low rumble came from deep in its chest, But it wasn't the same aggressive roar from before. This was different. Curious, maybe. I grew up around things like you, David continued. He kept his voice calm and even. Not exactly like you, but close enough. Mean sons of bitches that would tear you apart if you showed fear. But if you understood them, if you respected what they were, sometimes you could exist near them without dying. The creature moved along the barrier, circling to view him from different angles. David didn't turn to follow its movement. He stayed relaxed, non-threatening. My dad taught me something, he said to the empty air. He said every animal, no matter how dangerous, is just trying to survive. They hunt because they're hungry. They kill because they're threatened. They don't do it for fun or because they're evil. They're just being what they are. Sker completed its circle and returned to face him directly. It lowered itself to the ground on the other side of the barrier, its eyes level with David's. You've killed a lot of people here, David said. I heard the researchers talking. 14, they said. But I don't think you're a monster. I think you're scared and angry and trapped. Just like me. For the next hour they sat in silence. David didn't move, didn't try to entertain or engage. He simply existed in the space, breathing steadily, showing no fear or aggression. Sker remained still as well, watching him with an intensity that felt like it was looking into his soul. In the observation room above, Professor Helm watched through cameras with growing fascination. He had expected the human to show fear, to press against the far wall, to beg for removal. Instead, this David Reed sat calmly within striking distance of the most dangerous creature in the facility. Even more remarkable, Sker had stopped displaying any aggressive behavior. Run the stress analysis on both subjects, Helm ordered. Tess pulled up the data. The human's heart rate is normal. Breathing is relaxed. No signs of anxiety or fear response. He's completely calm. And Sker, also calm. Professor, I've never seen these readings from the Ravager before. It's not in hunting mode. It's not in territorial defense mode. It's just observing. Helm leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screens. Increase observation to continuous monitoring. I want every interaction recorded and analyzed. This human is the key to something we've been missing. Days passed in the split chamber. David fell into a new routine. He would wake, eat his meals, and spend hours near the barrier with Sker. He talked sometimes, sharing stories from his life. Other times he simply sat in silence. The creature seemed content with both approaches. He told Sker about his childhood on the frontier, about learning to read animal tracks and understand predator behavior. He described the ridge runners and how his father had taught him to move through their territory without being attacked. He explained that respect was different from submission, that understanding was different from control. Sker began responding in small ways. When David approached the barrier, the creature would come to meet him. When David sat, Sker would lower itself to the same level. When David spoke, the creature's eyes would focus with clear attention. On the 15th day, David tried something new. He pressed his hand against the barrier. Sker stared at the hand for a long moment, then slowly raised one of its own limbs and placed it against the transparent wall, matching the position. They stayed like that, separated by an unbreakable barrier but connected by something neither the researchers nor their instruments could measure. Professor Helm watched from the observation room, his breathing quick with excitement. This was unprecedented. This was impossible. This was everything he had been searching for. Prepare for stage 2, he said to his team. Direct contact in a controlled environment. Tess turned to him sharply. Professor, that's insane. Direct contact with Sker has a 99% fatality rate. You'll kill him. We'll take every precaution, Helm said, his eyes still on the screens. But this human has demonstrated an ability that defies our understanding. I must know how far it extends. I must know if the impossible can become possible. David didn't know about the plans being made above. He sat with Sker through another night, speaking softly about stars and ships and the freedom he missed. I don't know what they want from us, he said, but I know we're not getting out of here unless something changes. So we might as well make the best of it, right? Sker rumbled in response, a sound that almost seemed like agreement. In the darkness of the facility, a human and a killer sat together, separated by walls but beginning to understand each other in ways that science had never predicted. 3 researchers stood in the control room, all of them arguing against the plan. Tess was the loudest, her pale blue skin flushed darker with anger and fear. This is murder, she said, pointing at the simulation on the main screen. Every model shows the same result. The human dies within the first 30 seconds. Professor Helm remained calm, reviewing the data on his personal tablet. The models are based on previous interactions with trained handlers. This human is different. You've seen the recordings. Skier responds to him in ways we've never documented. Responding through a barrier is very different from sharing the same space, another researcher added. Once the creature has access, instinct will take over. It's still a ravager, which is exactly why we must test this, Helm said firmly. If this human truly has an ability to connect with apex predators, it changes everything we understand about interspecies communication. The applications would be revolutionary. Tess shook her head. You're using him as a test subject for your career advancement. This isn't about science. It's about your reputation. Helm looked up at her, his expression cold. Your objection is noted. But I am the director of this facility and the decision is made. Prepare the neutral chamber. We proceed tomorrow. In his cell, David was unaware of the debate happening above. He was lying on his platform thinking about the past weeks with Skur. The creature had become something like a companion, though he knew that word didn't quite fit. It was more like mutual recognition. Two beings trapped in a system neither had chosen, finding something like understanding across the barriers that held them. The door to his cell opened. Tess entered, and this time she closed it behind her. She stood there for a moment, clearly struggling with something. I need to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow, she said quietly. David sat up. Okay. They're going to put you in a room with Skier, no barriers. Direct contact. Her voice was tight. The professor believes you have some kind of special connection, but every calculation we've done shows that you'll die. The creature has killed 14 trained handlers. It won't hesitate to kill you too. David absorbed this information slowly. He had known something was coming. The increased observations, the way Helm watched him constantly, all of it pointed to something beyond simple research. Do I have a choice? He asked. Tess looked away. No, you're classified as research property. You have no legal rights here. Then why tell me? Because someone should, she said, meeting his eyes again. Because this is wrong and I can't stop it, but I can at least give you the truth. David nodded slowly. I appreciate that. Tess moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope the professor is right. I hope there is something special about your connection, because the alternative is too horrible to think about. After she left, David lay back down and stared at the ceiling. 14 people had died trying to control Skier. Trained professionals who knew about predators and had equipment and weapons. He was just a mechanic from a frontier colony. The smart thing to do would be to refuse to fight, to make them force him into that room. But he thought about Skier sitting on the other side of the barrier, matching his hand position. He thought about the way the creature had calmed when he spoke, the way it watched him with what seemed like intelligence rather than hunger. Maybe the other handlers had approached it wrong. Maybe they had tried to dominate instead of understand, or maybe he was about to die in a very stupid way. Sleep came eventually, though not easily. They came for him early. 4 guards and Professor Helm himself. David was led through the facility to a section he had never seen before. The neutral chamber was a large circular room with smooth walls and a high ceiling. There were no furnishings, no places to hide. Just empty space and bright lights from above. Medical technicians attached sensors to his body. They would monitor his vital signs during the test. A camera crew set up equipment to record from every angle. Helen watched it all with barely contained excitement. Do you understand what's about to happen? The professor asked. You're putting me in a room with your monster, David said. You want to see if it kills me or not. Skur is not a monster. It's a highly evolved predator acting according to its nature, and I don't want it to kill you. I want to document your interaction. Helen stepped closer. You've demonstrated an unusual rapport with the creature. I believe this is the next logical step in understanding that connection. And if you're wrong, then we'll learn something from your death, Helen said without emotion. All knowledge has value. David looked at the professor for a long moment. You're not a very good person, are you? Helen didn't respond. He simply gestured to the guards who moved David to the entrance of the chamber. Through another door on the opposite side, Skier would be released. David would have about 10 seconds alone in the room before the creature entered. That was all the preparation he would get. The guards removed his restraints and pushed him forward. The door sealed behind him with a heavy metallic sound. David stood in the center of the empty chamber and took a deep breath. His heart was racing now, adrenaline flooding his system, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, to calm his body, to remember everything his father had taught him about facing dangerous animals. Don't run. Don't show fear. Don't make aggressive moves. Respect the predator, but don't submit to it. Find the balance between confidence and caution. A buzzer sounded. The door on the opposite side began to open. Skur emerged from the darkness beyond, its 8 limbs moving with liquid grace. The creature paused at the threshold, its 6 eyes scanning the room. They locked onto David immediately. In the observation room above, every researcher held their breath. The cameras recorded everything. The sensors showed David's heart rate spiking but then steadying. Skur's body language shifted into something that the analysis software couldn't categorize. Not hunting. Not defending. Something else. The Ravager moved forward slowly. Each step was deliberate, controlled. It circled David from a distance just as it had done through the barrier. David turned his head to track the movement but kept his body relaxed. He didn't square his shoulders or ball his fists. He just stood there, breathing, existing. Skur completed its circle and approached from the front. Closer now. Close enough that David could see the texture of its natural armor, the way its muscles moved beneath the surface. The creature was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. It stopped just beyond arm's reach and lowered its head to David's level. Those 6 black eyes stared into his with an intensity that felt like a question. Who are you? What are you? Why aren't you afraid? David slowly raised his hand, the same gesture he had made at the barrier. His movement was smooth and unthreatening. He held his hand out, palm open, fingers relaxed. Hey there, he said softly. Remember me? Skur's eyes focused on the hand. Seconds passed. In the observation room, Tess was gripping the edge of the console so hard her knuckles had turned white. Professor Helm leaned forward, barely breathing. Then Skur moved. One of its limbs reached out slowly, the curved claw retracting until it was almost flat. The creature touched David's hand gently, the contact lasting only a moment before withdrawing. David smiled. Good to see you too. He took a small step forward. Skur didn't retreat. David raised his other hand and placed it against the creature's armored head. The surface was warm and surprisingly smooth. Skur held perfectly still, allowing the contact, accepting it. Everyone thought you were a monster, David said quietly. But you're not. You're just scared and alone, aren't you? They hurt you, tried to break you, and you defended yourself the only way you knew how. A low rumble came from Skur's chest, but this time David was close enough to feel it, and he understood. It wasn't a growl. It was something closer to a purr, if such a sound could come from something so large and dangerous. In the observation room, the researchers stared at their screens in stunned silence. The impossible was happening right in front of them. Professor Helm stood frozen, his theories crumbling and reforming. Everything he thought he knew about predator behavior suddenly uncertain, and in the chamber below, a human and a killer stood together, the gap between species bridged by something science couldn't measure, but both of them could feel. News of the successful contact spread through the facility within hours. Researchers who had never shown interest in David or Skur suddenly wanted access to the data. Professor Helm fielded calls from academic institutions across 3 sectors, all demanding information about his methods. His reputation, which had been solid but unremarkable, suddenly skyrocketed. David found himself spending more time with Skur. They moved him to a larger shared space, still monitored but less restrictive than before. The creature stayed close to him constantly now. When David sat, Skur would settle nearby. When he moved, the Ravager followed. It was protective behavior, though none of the researchers wanted to admit that was what they were seeing. Subject Skur displays pack-bonding characteristics with the human, one researcher noted in her report. This contradicts established understanding of Ravager social structure, which is typically solitary. Professor Helm began designing new experiments. If David could establish contact with Skur, perhaps he could be used to make the creature cooperate with testing. Medical scans that had been impossible before. Genetic samples. Behavioral studies that required the subject to perform specific actions. David realized what was happening during the 3rd week. A researcher entered their shared space and asked him to make Skur move to a different area. so they could install new monitoring equipment. When David refused, the researcher explained that his cooperation was not optional. He was still property, still subject to the facility's rules. "If you don't help us," the researcher said, "we'll restrict your access to the creature. You'll go back to your cell and Skur will go back to isolation." David looked at Skur, who was watching the exchange with clear attention. The creature understood tone if not words. It knew something was wrong. He helped them move the equipment. It happened again and again over the following days. They needed blood samples from Skur, something that had always required sedation before. Could David keep the creature calm during the procedure? They wanted to test Skur's strength and reaction time. Could David encourage it to perform the tasks? They wanted to introduce controlled stressors to measure aggressive responses. Could David prevent the creature from attacking the equipment? Each time David complied, not because he agreed with the research, but because the alternative was separation, and he had seen what isolation did to Skur. The creature needed connection, needed something beyond the sterile walls and cold observation. If David refused, they would both end up alone again, but it gnawed at him. He was being used as a tool, and through him, Skur was being used as well. Tess noticed the change in him. She still made regular checks on the specimens, and she could see the frustration building in David's expression. "You're unhappy," she said during one of her visits. It wasn't a question. "I'm a prisoner helping you imprison something else," David replied. He was sitting against a wall while Skur rested nearby. "I thought maybe connecting with Skur would make things better for both of us. Instead, it just gave them a new way to exploit us." Tess looked around to make sure no other researchers were in earshot. She moved closer and lowered her voice. "There's something you should know about this facility. Professor Helm doesn't have authorization for most of what happens here. The specimens, including you, were acquired illegally. The research isn't approved by any galactic ethics board. If the authorities knew what was happening, everyone here would face criminal charges." David looked up at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been complicit in something terrible and I need to stop pretending it's acceptable." She glanced at Skur. "That creature has been here for 3 years. 3 years of isolation and abuse, and it's not alone. There are dozens of specimens in this facility, all taken from their homes, all trapped here until they die. None of them will ever be released. What can we do about it?" "I don't know yet," Tess admitted. "But I wanted you to understand the full situation. This place is illegal. Your presence here is illegal. And eventually, someone is going to discover it." She left before David could ask more questions. He sat in silence, processing the information. Skur shifted closer to him, sensing his troubled mood. David reached out and placed a hand on the creature's armored head, a gesture that had become comfortable for both of them. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly. "Both of us." The days continued. David went through the motions, helping with the research because he had no choice. But he started paying more attention to the facility's layout. He noticed where the security stations were located. He saw which doors required special clearance and which could be opened by any researcher. He memorized the schedules, understanding when shifts changed and when the facility was least staffed. Skur seemed to understand that something was different. The creature became more alert, more watchful. When researchers entered their space, Skur would position itself between them and David. When equipment was moved, the Ravager tracked every item with focused attention. The bond between human and predator had grown stronger, but it was no longer just about connection. It was becoming about protection. Professor Helm noticed the change as well. During one of his observation sessions, he noted that Skur was displaying territorial behavior around David. The creature saw the human as something to guard, something valuable. "Fascinating," Helm murmured. "The Ravager has adopted protective instincts. This suggests a depth of emotional capacity we never predicted." He ordered increased observation. More cameras were installed. More sensors were added. Every interaction between David and Skur was recorded and analyzed. The professor was preparing to publish his findings, to share his breakthrough with the academic community. This would be his legacy, the discovery that would define his career. But late one night, an alarm triggered in the facility's communication center. An automated message had been received from the Galactic Patrol. A routine inspection would be conducted within 3 days. All facilities in the sector were required to provide access to inspection teams. Professor Helm received the notification and felt ice form in his chest. A patrol inspection. They would see the specimens. They would review the acquisition records. They would discover everything. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. 6 researchers gathered in the conference room, all of them showing varying degrees of panic. "We have 3 days," Helen said, his voice tight with stress. 3 days to eliminate any evidence of illegal activity. What does that mean? One researcher asked. Helen looked at each of them in turn. It means the specimens must be destroyed. All of them. We'll claim they died of natural causes during research. We'll falsify the dates and records. When the patrol arrives, they'll find a clean facility conducting legitimate studies on common species. Tess, who had been standing at the back of the room, stepped forward. "You're talking about murder. Dozens of sentient beings." "I'm talking about survival," Helen snapped. "If they discover what we've been doing, we all face life imprisonment. Everything we've worked for will be destroyed. This is the only option." "There has to be another way," Tess insisted. "There isn't." Helen pulled up a display showing the facility's containment systems. "The elimination protocol is already prepared. It will be quick and painless. Sedative gas, then termination. They won't suffer." Tess looked at the other researchers, hoping one of them would object. But fear had silenced them all. They were going to kill the specimens to save themselves. She left the conference room as soon as the meeting ended. She had 3 days to figure out how to stop this. 3 days to save lives that the galaxy had already forgotten. She went directly to David's space. He was resting with Skier, both of them lying near each other in comfortable silence. When Tess entered, they both looked up at her. She saw intelligence in both sets of eyes, understanding that something was very wrong. "We need to talk," she said urgently. "Right now. About survival." David stood up and Skier rose with him. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. In the observation room above, cameras recorded everything. But for the first time since the facility opened, no one was watching the screens. They were all too busy preparing for an extinction. Tess spoke quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. She explained the inspection, the elimination protocol, the 3-day countdown. David listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. "They're going to pump sedative gas through the ventilation systems," Tess said. "Once the specimens are unconscious, they'll introduce a lethal agent. Everything dies within minutes. Then they dispose of the bodies and alter the records." "When?" David asked. "Tomorrow night. They want time to clean the facility before the patrol arrives." Skier moved closer to David, sensing the tension. The creature's 6 eyes were fixed on Tess, recognizing her as the source of distress. David placed a calming hand on the Ravager's armored head. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I can't stop it alone," Tess said. "I don't have the authority or the access codes. But I can help you, if you're willing to try." "Try what?" "To break out. To free the specimens. To make sure someone knows what's happening here before Helen can cover it all up." David looked around the room, calculating. "The doors are sealed. The facility is in orbit. Even if we got out of this room, where would we go?" Tess pulled out her datapad, showing him a schematic of the facility. "There are escape pods in the emergency section. If we can reach them, we can get away before the patrol arrives. Once we're in the pods, we can send distress signals. The patrol will be obligated to investigate. And the other specimens? We open everything. Every cell, every containment unit. Let chaos do the work for us. In the confusion, we get to the pods." David studied the schematic, tracing possible routes with his eyes. It was a desperate plan, full of risks and uncertainties. But the alternative was death for everyone. "What about security?" he asked. "There are 4 guards on night shift. If we move quickly and create enough confusion, we might get past them." Tess looked at Skier. "And you have the facility's most dangerous weapon on your side." David followed her gaze to the Ravager. The creature was intelligent enough to understand that something important was happening. Its body language was alert, ready to act. "Skier isn't a weapon," David said quietly. "It's a person." "Then treat it like one," Tess replied. "Give it a choice. Freedom or death. See what it chooses." David turned to face Skier fully. He knew the creature couldn't understand his exact words, but tone and body language could communicate enough. He kept his voice calm but serious. "We need to leave this place," he said. "It's going to be dangerous. There will be fighting. You could get hurt or I could. But if we stay here, they're going to kill us. Both of us, do you understand?" Skier's eyes remained locked on his. The creature made a low sound, not aggressive but determined. Then it moved to the door and waited, its posture clearly saying it was ready. Tess pulled up the facility's system access on her datapad. I can override your room's lock remotely. Once you're out, head to the specimen containment level. I'll open every cell from the control room. That should give us about 10 minutes before security realizes what's happening. What about you? David asked. I'll meet you at the emergency section. Pod Bay 3. She looked at him seriously. If I don't make it, go anyway. Get the story out. Make sure people know what Helen did here. David nodded. Thank you. For this. Don't thank me. I should have done something months ago. She pressed a button on her pad. You're unlocked. Move fast. The door to David's space slid open. He stepped into the corridor with Skur beside him. The facility's night lighting cast everything in a dim blue glow. In the distance, he could hear the hum of machinery and the occasional footstep of a patrolling guard. They moved quickly and quietly. Skur's 8 limbs made almost no sound despite the creature's size. David led them toward the containment level, following the route he had memorized from weeks of observation. They passed empty research labs and storage areas, avoiding the main corridors where security was more likely to patrol. An alarm began blaring. Tess had started opening the cells. The sound echoed through the facility, and suddenly everything was in motion. Specimen after specimen emerged from containment, confused and frightened but sensing opportunity. The crystalline creature from the cell across from David's original room stumbled into the corridor, its forearms waving uncertainly. The plant being unfurled itself and began moving on root-like appendages. The geometric shape spun rapidly as it floated through the air. Doors throughout the facility were opening. Creatures that had been imprisoned for months or years suddenly found themselves free. Some fled immediately, searching for exits. Others stayed near their cells, uncertain what to do with their freedom. A few began destroying equipment in rage, venting months of frustration on the tools that had been used to study them. Security guards responded, rushing toward the containment level with weapons drawn. But they had trained for controlling individual specimens, not dealing with dozens of freed beings all at once. The first guard to enter the specimen level was knocked aside by a large creature with 6 legs and a thick hide. He fell hard, his weapon skittering across the floor. David and Skur reached the main containment corridor. All around them was chaos. Specimens running, guards shouting, alarms blaring. David pointed toward a stairwell that led to the upper levels. That way, he said. They ran. Skur moved with incredible speed, its 8 limbs propelling it forward faster than David could run. The creature slowed to keep pace with him, staying close enough to protect but not so close that it would trip him. A guard appeared at the top of the stairwell, blocking their path. He raised a weapon, some kind of energy pistol.
Stop or I'll fire.
Skur surged forward before David could react. The Ravager covered the distance in 2 seconds, moving with the predatory efficiency it had been born with. One of its limbs struck the weapon from the guard's hand. Another swept his legs out from under him. The guard fell, and Skur pinned him to the ground without seriously injuring him. David hurried past, calling for Skur to follow. The creature released the guard and bounded after him. They reached the upper level where the research labs and administrative offices were located. This area was less chaotic with fewer specimens and more staff. Scientists and technicians were scrambling to understand what was happening, some fleeing toward escape routes while others tried to secure valuable data. Professor Helm was in his office, frantically trying to activate the elimination protocol manually. If he could start the process now before everything fell apart completely, he might still save his research. He might still preserve his reputation. His door burst open. Skur entered first, moving with terrifying speed. Helm stumbled backward, pressing against the wall. The Ravager he had kept imprisoned for 3 years was free and in his office. David entered behind Skur, breathing hard from the run. He looked at Professor Helm with something between anger and pity. Your facility is coming apart, David said. Your specimens are free. In about an hour, the patrol is going to find out exactly what you've been doing here. Helm stared at him. You've destroyed everything. Years of research and valuable data. You were going to kill us all to hide your crimes, David replied. Every being in this facility just to protect yourself. They're specimens, Helm said weakly. Research subjects. They're people, David corrected. Every single one. And you're going to answer for what you did to them. Skur moved closer to Helm, its eyes fixed on the professor. The creature rumbled, a sound David had learned to recognize as anger. But David placed a hand on Skur's side, a gentle touch. "No," he said softly.
"He's not worth it."
"Let him face justice instead." Skur hesitated, then stepped back. The creature's intelligence showed in that moment of restraint, the choice to trust David's judgment over its own instincts. They left Helen cowering in his office and continued toward the emergency section. Other freed specimens had found their way there as well, drawn by the hope of escape. Tess was already at Pod Bay 3 overriding the launch protocols. "Get in," she shouted over the noise. "All of you." Specimens crowded into the escape pods, far more than they were designed to hold, but no one cared about safety regulations anymore. David and Skur entered the last pod with several other creatures. Tess climbed in behind them and sealed the door. "Launch in 10 seconds, she said, activating the sequence. The pod detached from the facility with a violent shudder. Through the small viewport, David could see the research station shrinking behind them. Other pods were launching as well, scattering in different directions. Some would be picked up by the patrol, others would drift until someone found them. But they were all free. Skur pressed close to David in the cramped space, seeking the comfort of contact. David wrapped an arm around the creature's armored head, feeling the warmth beneath the surface. "We made it," he said quietly. The pod's emergency beacon activated automatically, broadcasting their location. Help would come. Questions would be asked. The truth would come out. And somewhere behind them, Professor Helm sat alone in his failing facility, watching everything he had built collapse into ruin. The Galactic patrol vessel arrived 6 hours after the escape pods launched. They found the research facility in shambles, with several specimens still wandering the corridors, and Professor Helm locked in his office, too terrified to come out. The patrol officers took one look at the situation and immediately called for backup. Within 2 days, investigators from 3 different agencies descended on the facility. They reviewed the records, interviewed the staff, and cataloged the illegal activities that had been conducted there. The evidence was overwhelming. Professor Helm and his senior researchers were arrested and charged with multiple violations of galactic law, including illegal abduction, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted murder. The escape pods were recovered one by one. Most of the specimens survived the ordeal, though all of them were traumatized by their captivity. The Galactic Council faced difficult questions about what to do with beings who had been taken from their homes but couldn't safely return. David and Skur were picked up by a patrol cruiser 16 hours after their launch. The officers approached their pod cautiously, weapons ready, expecting the Ravager to be hostile. Instead, they found David sitting calmly with the creature resting beside him, both of them exhausted but unharmed. "We need to separate you from that thing," the patrol captain said. "For your own safety." "No," David replied firmly. "We stay together." The captain started to argue, but Tess, who had been recovered in a different pod, intervened. She explained the situation, describing the bond between human and Ravager and warning that forcing separation would likely result in violence. "The creature sees him as pack," she said. "If you try to take them apart, Skur will defend David, and trust me, you don't want that fight." The patrol reluctantly agreed to keep them together during transport. They were taken to a processing station where officials tried to determine what should be done with all the freed specimens. It was unprecedented. There were beings from 17 different species, taken from 12 different worlds. Some could be returned home. Others, like Skur, came from locations too dangerous or remote for safe retrieval missions. David spent 3 days answering questions. Investigators wanted to know everything about his time at the facility, his interactions with Professor Helm, and especially his relationship with Skur. They seemed unable to comprehend how he had formed a bond with a creature that had killed so many others. "I treated it with respect," David explained for the 20th time. "I didn't try to dominate or control. I just tried to understand." "But it's an apex predator," one investigator said. "A killer by nature. So are humans," David replied. "Under the right circumstances. But we're also capable of connection, loyalty, and trust. Skur is too. Everyone just assumed it was a mindless beast because that made it easier to justify what they were doing." The investigator made notes, clearly skeptical but unable to argue with the results. David was alive. Skur had protected him during the escape. The bond was real, even if it defied conventional understanding. On the fourth day, a representative from the Galactic Council arrived at the processing station. She was an elderly Thorian with deep green skin and tired eyes that had seen too much bureaucracy. "We have a problem," she said, sitting across from David in a small conference room. Sker lay on the floor nearby, always within sight of David. "There are 47 specimens from Professor Helm's facility. 22 can be returned to their homeworlds with some effort. But 25 cannot. Their worlds are too dangerous, too remote, or they were taken as juveniles and wouldn't survive being released into the wild." "So what happens to them?" David asked. "That's the problem. We don't have facilities equipped to house them long term. And after the scandal of illegal research stations, no legitimate institution wants to take them." She looked at Sker. "Especially not apex predators that require specialized care." "You want to put them down," David said flatly. "Not want," the representative corrected, "but it may be the only humane option. Keeping them in containment indefinitely is just another form of prison. We can't release them where they'll die. Euthanasia done properly might be the kindest choice." David felt anger rising in his chest. They survived captivity, torture, and almost being murdered to cover up crimes. "And your solution is to kill them anyway?" "I'm open to alternatives," the representative said, "but I haven't heard any viable options." David sat in silence for a moment, thinking. Then an idea formed. Crazy and impractical, but perhaps the only answer that made sense. "Give them a world," he said. The representative blinked. "Excuse me?" "Find a world that's suitable for habitation but not claimed by any species. Put the specimens there. Let them live free. That's not practical. These are beings from different worlds with different environmental needs. They can't all survive on one planet. Then find one that's close enough," David pressed. "Somewhere with varied environments. Mountains and forests and plains. Make it work. And who would oversee this? Who would ensure the specimens adapt? Who would prevent them from harming each other?" David met her eyes. "I would." The representative stared at him. "You want to live on an unsettled world with 24 potentially dangerous specimens, most of which you can't even communicate with?" "I can try," David said. "And I won't be alone." Tess said she wanted to help. I'm sure others would volunteer too. People who actually care about these beings instead of seeing them as problems to solve. This is absurd. More absurd than killing them after everything they've been through. David leaned forward. "Look, I know I'm just a mechanic from a frontier colony. I'm nobody important, but I'm the one who proved that Sker wasn't a mindless killer. I'm the one who showed that understanding works better than control. Give me a chance to prove it works with others too." The representative was quiet for a long time, considering. Finally, she sighed. "I'll present your proposal to the council, but I make no promises. This would be expensive, complicated, and potentially dangerous." "Everything worthwhile is," David replied. It took 6 weeks of negotiations, debates, and bureaucratic wrangling. But eventually, the Galactic Council approved the plan. They identified a world in an unclaimed sector, a planet with diverse environments and no sentient native species. They agreed to fund the initial setup and provide periodic supply deliveries. And they granted David legal guardianship over the specimens who couldn't return home. Tess volunteered immediately. 2 other researchers from the facility, ones who had secretly opposed Professor Helm's methods, also joined. A cargo ship was chartered to transport everyone to the new world. Professor Helm heard about the plan from his prison cell. He watched news reports about the sanctuary world and saw David being interviewed about his goals. The human who had been nothing but a research subject was now being called a hero, a pioneer in interspecies relations. Everything Helen had tried to achieve through cold science and ruthless methodology, David had accomplished through simple compassion. The irony was not lost on him. The journey to the sanctuary world took 3 weeks. David spent most of that time with Sker and the other specimens, learning what he could about each one's needs and behaviors. Some were more receptive than others. The crystalline creature seemed friendly and curious. The plant being was peaceful and content. A few of the more aggressive specimens remained wary, but they didn't attack. When they finally arrived and the ship landed on the new world, David stood at the ramp and looked out at open sky and untouched wilderness. The air was breathable. The temperature was mild. In the distance, mountains rose against a purple-tinted sky with 2 small moons visible even in daylight. Sker stood beside him, the creature's 6 eyes scanning the landscape. For the first time since its capture, the Ravager was seeing an open horizon, Unlimited space. Freedom. David placed a hand on Skur's armored head. What do you think? The creature rumbled, a sound David had learned to interpret as contentment. Skur moved forward down the ramp, stepping onto soil and grass, testing this new environment. Other specimens followed, emerging from the ship cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Tess came to stand beside David, watching the beings spread out and explore. "Do you really think this will work?" she asked. "I don't know," David admitted, "but it's better than the alternative. And I think if we give them time and space and respect, they'll figure out how to live here." "What about you? You gave up any chance of going home for this?" David looked at Skur, who was now racing across an open field with several other specimens, reveling in the simple act of running without walls to stop them. He smiled. "I think I am home," he said, "for the first time in a long time." Over the following months, the sanctuary began to take shape. Simple shelters were built for the specimens who needed them. Food sources were identified and cultivated. Territories were naturally established as different beings found areas that suited them. There were conflicts and challenges, but nothing that couldn't be resolved with patience and understanding. Skur remained close to David most of the time, but the creature also began to explore its own independence. It would disappear for hours, running through forests and climbing cliffs, experiencing the wildness it had been denied for so long. But it always returned to David, drawn by the bond they had formed in captivity and strengthened in freedom. One evening, David sat on a hill overlooking the settlement as the two moons rose. Skur lay beside him, both of them comfortable in silence. Other specimens were visible in the distance, living their lives, no longer prisoners or test subjects, but simply beings allowed to exist. A year ago, David had been a mechanic on a cargo ship, living a simple life with simple goals. Then pirates and captivity and a chance encounter with a creature everyone called a killer. Now he was here, on an unnamed world, caring for beings most people would consider monsters. It was strange how life changed. How a moment of eye contact through reinforced barriers could lead to all of this. Skur shifted closer, a gesture of trust and affection. David rested his hand on the creature's head and looked up at the unfamiliar stars. The professor's pet killer had bowed to no one, and it still didn't. But it sat beside a human who had never asked it to bow, who had offered understanding instead of dominance, who had seen a person where others saw only a beast. And in that quiet moment under alien moons, both human and Ravager understood what freedom truly meant. Not the absence of walls, but the presence of choice. The choice to trust. The choice to protect. The choice to stay. They had chosen each other, and that made all the difference.